I'm Ben Weingarten, and this is the Weingarten Report, the show where we bring you the most critical stories and most compelling arguments and analyses on the most vital issues of our time. The Weingarten Report is brought to you by AMAC. In this week's episode, we remember 9/11, reflect on its lessons, and vow to honor the fallen. 9/11 touched me in a personal way, growing up in the New Jersey suburbs, a short 40-minute drive from lower Manhattan. At the time, my father was working right across the street from the New York Stock Exchange, a stone's throw from the World Trade Center. 9/11 for my 8th grade self started as a perfect fall day in a leafy town at the start of a school year filled with promise. And it was the day that myself and my classmates, our generation, and arguably the country itself, lost our collective innocence. Nothing would ever be the same. Will so-and-so please report to the main office? Those words kept echoing again and again from creaky middle school loudspeakers. They're still haunting. Each call dismissed one student after another from school, holding the ominous potential of the worst fate for them and their loved ones. One classmate would never see his father again. Others would return home to hugs and kisses from parents vowing never to speak of what they had seen again. A small plane hit the World Trade Center, someone had reported early that morning in the lunchroom before classes started. We shrugged it off at the time. But the faces of the teachers and the non-classes that droned on agonizingly that day told my 8th grade classmates and I a different story, that this wasn't just some rumor. Something incomprehensibly wrong was afoot. We were in the dark. The TVs in school were kept off, and maybe that was for the best. We just started hearing rumor after terrifying rumor that the White House was hit and the Empire State Building, and that America was under attack. I wondered if my father, who I vaguely understood was working on a project in the Wall Street area, was okay. It wasn't until early that afternoon when my mother came to pick me up from school, telling me in disbelief and with feeling that the World Trade Center no longer exists, that I began to understand, as best one could, the gravity of what had transpired. We were incredibly lucky. My father was safe. He had called that morning from his office near the stock exchange, which he feared might be a target, before my mother knew what was happening, to say he was fine and was getting ready to move out of his office. He wouldn't return until late in the day, as he worked to get his colleagues out of New York safely. Once I was home, I saw for the first time the unthinkable images of the events of that day, watched them over and over, and couldn't make sense of them. I would do the same thing for weeks, transfixed like I'm sure you were. As I waited for my father to come home, I remember going out on the front lawn with my younger brother to have a baseball catch. As a 13-year-old kid, America's national pastime was the only thing that made sense. When my father finally came home, I recall he had a scowl and a hurt in his face that I could not remember ever having seen before. He was mentally and physically spent, running on fumes. And he was covered in soot, and perhaps worse. Over time, I would ask him about what he saw, and lament that he had seen it. I'll never forget visiting New York myself shortly after September 11, 2001, and seeing, walled off from blocks away, the twisted, heaping mass of smoldering iron, like some crushed erector set. I'll never forget the plume of smoke that billowed over Ground Zero for what seemed like months and months thereafter. I'll never forget first seeing our old Volvo station wagon, which had been stranded in a New York garage for a long time after that fateful day, finally returning home, coated in that very same soot and probably worse as my father. That day left an indelible imprint on the lives of every American. I thank God for how lucky my family was, and far too many were not. It is those families that I think of, and every American should think of, as we reflect on 9/11 and our response to it. In my view, as a country, we have dishonored them, and those who have fallen in the decades since, while fighting in their name, with policies that have undermined America's national interest abroad and our freedom at home. The calamitous Afghanistan withdrawal, which followed the calamitous effort to try and turn Afghanistan into Switzerland at the cost of thousands of lives, tens of thousands of casualties, and trillions of dollars, epitomizes the failure to honor them. It's a disgrace. We sent men and women to fight and die to bring primitive, pre-civilizational Islamist gender studies. That was our response to jihadist attacks. Now, our leaders are running a domestic counterterror strategy that targets as potential extremists the very same men and women, veterans, particularly conservative ones, we sent to fight and die. This should outrage every American, the way we've dishonored those who died because they live free and because others simply cannot tolerate it and want us to live under their thumb in tyranny. The lessons of 9/11 that few in our ruling class have taken to heart are that we have to know our adversaries and see them free of rose-colored glasses for who they are. We needed to understand how and what jihadists believed and fight them accordingly. We needed to realize 9/11 was a core failure of immigration and put in place policies to prevent Islamists from ever entering the homeland and their aiders, abettors, and enablers from being able to provide them any aid and comfort here. We needed to realize that in the Islamic world, the strong course rules, which means you don't try and turn 7th century backwaters like Afghanistan into Jeffersonian democracies, but you respond with absolutely overwhelming force to crush adversaries in select situations as a warning to anyone who would dare endanger us or harbor those who would, that any threat to the United States would be mercilessly eliminated. You fight very small battles with incredible intensity to avoid very large wars that are endless. And we needed to fight without the political correctness that would have led us into nation building in the first place, and without purging the very materials that would allow us to identify the enemy's goals, strategy, and tactics, and even changing the name of the original war itself so as not to step on Islamist toes. We wouldn't do any of these things. And we needed to fight without sacrificing our liberty and justice at home by creating national security and intelligence powers ripe for abuse that were turned on Americans, as we've discussed at length here on the Weingarten report before. In short, we needed to know our enemies and ourselves. How should we honor the fallen after these last 2 decades of failure? We should be America once again, not a decadent, woke, rump kowtower to a gulag state, not a briber of mullahcrats like the Iranians that bend over backwards so as not to hurt the feelings of 7th century throat slitters who see weakness as an invitation to attack, not a nation that puts its warriors through struggle sessions, makes them social workers and babysitters in hellholes, and asks that they do it all again while hamstrung with suicidal rules of engagement that privilege their enemies. We should once again be a proud nation that cultivates excellence, that instills in its people confidence, that creates patriots. America, exceptional in the history of mankind, must be loved, cherished, and defended. The United States is a great country. It demands defending. If we keep going the way we're going, there will be little left to defend, and even fewer left who will be willing to defend it. Those who have died over these last 20 years must not have died in vain. Let us honor them with how we live.